Time waits for no one. As we observe this phrase graciously marking the beginning of our titular character's cathartic journey, the first thing that comes to mind probably isn't the fact that it's a rewording of a philosophical proverb that predates modern English. On the one hand, the quote provides a touch of blatant foreshadowing for when the narrative comes full circle during the film's climax, while on the other hand, what we as an audience can be left with is a reminder. One that will never stop being relevant to our everyday sensibilities, yet one that also seems so obvious, you'd almost feel ashamed that it was ever taken for granted. No one is so powerful that they can ever stop the march of time. As human beings, we begin to fade away the moment we're brought into existence, and now more than ever, what we're left with are people who seek to leave some form of imprint on the world before facing the inevitable. The more we come to identify the elements that make us who we are, the more we seek to instill those elements into everything we touch, so that whether it's through the people we raise or the works we create, a legacy is left behind that we can vicariously live through.
That hurt.
Now, like many artists that have come before him, Japanese animation director Mamoru Hosoda himself is no stranger to taking the most prominent moral values that he's come to appreciate during the course of his life, and infusing them into the very films that have generated the solid recognition he has today. After he studied oil painting at the Kanazawa College of Art, Hosoda first came to public attention in the early 2000s, building off of some of the most beloved franchises of all time. Even with his distinct detachment from the usually carefree yet high-strung style of presentation that both One Piece and Digimon were known for, Hosoda's rough yet sincere touch still led to some of the most memorable, heart-wrenching moments these respective franchises have ever seen. However, it wasn't until the mid-2000s that Hosoda truly began to diversify himself with his other films, and allow people a better look at the man behind the metaphorical camera. The Girl Who Leapt Through Time was a film that explored the powerfully effective moral of living life in the present, a message that flowed so effortlessly in one definitive direction that it's hard to believe it's woven into a story about a girl who travels back and forth in time repeatedly. With a narrative wrapped in the wistful buoyancy of a girl learning to take life into her own hands, I'd argue this mirrors and even justifies the director's previously established rebellious nature in full swing. Just as Makoto embarks on her own coming-of-age story that would lay the foundation for her eventual approach into adulthood, this film marked the beginning of Hosoda's independence and maturity as a director coming into his own. For even though The Girl Who Leapt Through Time was meant to be connected to a distinct piece of Japanese literature, Hosoda's previous efforts seem to have finally paid off, as he crafts a work far removed from the world it was supposed to be attached to, so much so that aside from one or two offhanded references, the film largely remains its own clever work.
Hey, you want a job?
Of course, much like how an adult feels the need to improve upon what he learned during the years of his adolescence, Hosoda would later make use of his newfound independence in order to go back and revive one of his previous stories in the form of Summer Wars. Except, instead of focusing on a small group of kids who were continuously faced with a destiny far greater than they could ever understand, we're instead presented with an adolescent protagonist confronting a very large extended family. Fitting, since this film was in production around the time Hosoda got married and his own family became much larger than he probably ever thought was possible. Everything from the bombastic orchestrations to the brightly colored spontaneity were all indicative of this arguably vague, yet relatable idea of a family coming together, preparing for the dangerous hardships that we might have never thought would affect us. It was a film that showed no matter how great the obstacle might be, family is something that is always there for you, and we must remember to move forward with them, and never in spite of them. All of this would then accumulate into what many consider Hosoda's magnum opus and most personal work, Wolf Children. Having just become a father himself, and obviously recounting a time where he grew up with his own single mother, this exhibit of first-hand affection feels so poignant that you could practically see every emotion dripping off the screen. While there are those who might find this overabundance of personal display off-putting, it's difficult to not appreciate the intention and genuine respect Hosoda obviously has for the role parents play to their children, and the never-ending tribulations of raising one. Overall, I think it's fair to say that if The Girl Who Leapt Through Time was the proverbial foot that got Hosoda through the door of standard recognition, then Wolf Children was the stamp that helped put his name on an international level. So much so that people are hailing him as the next Hayao Miyazaki. And regardless of the reasoning behind these rather loaded comparisons, I'd be lying if I said they were completely baseless.
無限の可能性を持っている子供が生まれてくるんだけど、その可能性を次々と諦めていくことなんですよ。何かはもうしょうがないです。人間の存在そのものはそういうものなんだから。
Both can be considered directors that have a strong mutual understanding of the human condition, so much so that sometimes the drive to portray these struggles ends up taking precedent over the stories themselves. Nowhere is this more prominent than in Hosoda's most recent cinematic endeavor, The Boy and the Beast, a film that focused heavily on recreating this ambiguous feeling of fatherhood to the point where it became exposed to the same narrative shortcomings that could be found in some of Miyazaki's other works, such as Ponyo and Howl's Moving Castle.
Come on, you should feel sorry for
With
me.
the latter, ironically, being a film that was originally meant to be directed by Hosoda himself. However, if I were to take a moment and select a favorite scene from The Boy and the Beast.
Be your master. Do as he does.
It would have to be during the end of the film's first act, where we see a brief training montage that not only effortlessly portrays a significant passage of time, but also marks the pivotal moment where Kumatetsu and Kyota begin to learn from one another as a family unit. Now, you could make the argument that this scene was so quick to stick out to me because I grew up on Rocky, a series of films who seem to have perfected this now commonplace cinematic cliché. Or maybe it's because, having left the theater with my own father, I was reminded of the training regimen I myself was put through when I was younger. But despite what initially drew me in, I really couldn't help but think, wow, what a perfect metaphor that exemplifies why Hosoda really isn't the next Hayao Miyazaki. While I'm sure the idea comes with nothing but good intentions, I wouldn't be surprised if people are unaware that saying yes to the question posited in this video's title does give off the general impression that one director is simply a carbon copy of another. But just when it appears like Hosoda will end up repeating the same narrative beats that Miyazaki became known for, their final voice ends up saying something completely different, as the two really do end up becoming their own masters. Because while it is true that Hosoda has proven to be quite good at creating an atmosphere whose sole purpose is to generate a specific type of emotion, just like Hayao Miyazaki can, the fundamental breakdown of what makes their films work so well couldn't possibly be more different. Miyazaki's the type of director that likes to leave his audiences with an immersive cinematic experience, by dropping them in an environment that some would argue even the creator himself doesn't fully understand on a practical level.
こうやって分かんないって人がいっぱい出てくるんです。分かんないのを誇る人たちがいるからね。
Even when a film looks like it could take place in our own world, there's always something distinctly alien about what's being presented, in order to make the big picture feel unique and completely detached from what might have come before or preceded it since. How many of you were unsure of how to feel when you first saw the forest spirits in Princess Mononoke, or No Face in Spirited Away? Were you impressed by the grand display of imagination and beauty? Or were you terrified after being presented with these looming figures that defied our modern sensibilities?
我が名は明日か東の果てよりこの地へ来たそなたたちは獅子神の森に住むと聞く古い神か
そんな言葉で言えるほど簡単な世界だと思うかってこうなんか積年の怒りが溜まってるでしょ。
It's an emotional crossroad that can be hard to describe, but the appeal lies in the fact that we're not alone in our feelings. Because as Miyazaki focuses on a character's journey through this world, he does everything in his power to simultaneously make sure that you're right there with them for every well-drawn step of the way. Hosoda, on the other hand, goes for a much quieter theatrical approach.
If you could only be one thing, would you be people or wolves?
His films are less about normal people living in a strange world and more about taking those fantastical elements and grounding them all within walking distance of his own birthplace. Despite the fact that the setting is always kept modern and the moral lessons are tied to specifically pivotal turning points in people's lives, there always seems to be this need to keep the audience at a certain distance. The camera holds longer before cutting, so we're allowed to just see interactions unfold as they are, which makes it harder to find room for self-insertion. And even though he'll show the same shot multiple times, they're always framed in a way that makes it clear that we are the outsiders looking in. Now, that isn't to say Hosoda's films are any less emotionally effective than Miyazaki's approach, because, if anything, it implores us to come to terms with the fact that we can't console or be intimate with these characters we've come to appreciate, especially when we see them go through problems that even the most hardened of human beings can understand. Everything about Hosoda's approach is kept delightfully minimalistic. This may also explain why Yoshiyuki Sadamoto's designs are much more rounded and gentle compared to his usual style, especially when they're laid up against the beautifully detailed backgrounds, but I digress. Naturally, there will be exceptions to every generality. One of my personal favorite films, The Wind Rises, can be considered Miyazaki's most personal work that relies heavily on simplicity, while Hosoda could be praised for his balance of spectacle and applicable degree of social commentary in Summer Wars, even if the subject matter is different from anything Miyazaki has ever done. But regardless of any overlap in their filmographies, the fact remains that Hosoda is a very different kind of storyteller than Miyazaki, something that I must stress is in no way a bad thing. The idea of comparing and contrasting works of art, let alone the people who create them, is never as simple an endeavor as we would like it to be. But that's okay, because the amount of talent and diversity amongst animation directors, whether they be for movies or television shows, does lend itself to a multitude of colorful, nuanced stories that should be appreciated on an individual level. Still, if the sheer length of this video is any indication, I find myself coming down harder on this comparison whenever it's brought up, as opposed to others. I'm not saying we shouldn't compare those who take on a similar approach to their craft, as sometimes that is only necessary. But if we let these notions reach the point of suggesting supplementation, then we risk losing the individual voices that these artists are trying so hard to create. You might suggest I'm being overly dramatic, but I'd like to think that this fear is coming from a very personal place. After all, not a day goes by where I don't feel as if my own individual voice becomes stilted by those who might have expressed similar thoughts before me. And I know for a fact that I'm not the only one who deals with that fear.
僕は美しい飛行機を作りたいと思っています。
In a community where people seem so insistent on looking at what they think technically makes a work of art, sometimes we forget that these basic human elements are all we need. Hosoda's films are a good example of straightforward, emotional-based artistic expression, showcasing that you don't need complex cinematography, editing, or deep symbolism to make an amazing film. Hayao Miyazaki is a man who's already left his own definitive mark on the world, and the impact he's had on people's lives is nothing short of undeniable. Even if someone were to come along and match or even exceed the technical or emotional feats that he's set, no one will ever end up replacing the legacy he's left behind. So to wrap up this video with its long overdue answer, no, I don't think Mamoru Hosoda will be the next Hayao Miyazaki. But I do think he has the potential to be the next Mamoru Hosoda. And whether it be 5, 10, or 20 years from now, I look forward to appreciating just what that ends up meaning.
Time waits for no one.
"一つ